Good morning on this Sunday, February 20th, and welcome to the Georgia Gang. New poll numbers show Republican primary voters favor incumbent Brian Kemp over former Senator David Perdue in the race for governor. Also, supporters of a new city of Buckhead vow to keep fighting after it appears the issue is dead this legislative session. And opposition mounts to the newly announced $5 billion Rivian plant. Melita, Phil, and Theron are here. Brian Robinson is back filling in for Martha. We are not virtual. We're just having some camera issues, so we are spread out across the studios. The debate and discussion begin right now.
From the Fox 5 studios, the Georgia Gang starts now.
New polling out this week shows Governor Brian Kemp with momentum on the Republican side with a 10-point lead over former Senator David Perdue.
It's great news, but today's a different day. You know, my goal is to win every single day. We're working extremely hard to do that. The voters will be the ultimate poll.
It was a good week for Governor Brian Kemp. He won the endorsement of the Police Benevolent Association, but also came out 10 points ahead of former Senator David Perdue in a newly released poll of likely GOP primary voters. Perdue, though, is spreading the message that he is the only Republican in the race endorsed by former President Donald Trump. The latest campaign finance reports show Kemp ahead in fundraising with $12.7 million on hand compared to Perdue's less than $1 million. But Democrat Stacey Abrams has come out on top when it comes to fundraising, taking in more than $9 million in a 2-month time frame.
Make no mistake, you know, my goal is to beat Stacey Abrams. I'm the only person in Georgia that's been able to do that. I plan on doing it again.
Phil, a lot to digest here. It's still early, but 3 months to go until the primary. Should David Perdue be worried at all?
Well, I think that the poll numbers are very interesting. The governor's camp obviously should be happy that he's got this lead for right now. But as we all know, watching campaigns, you have your ups and downs. And as you say, you've got 3 months to go. I think that it's a wake-up call to Mar-a-Lago and the Trump camp because they need to get their PACs started and getting money into the Perdue campaign. And what's also interesting in that Trafalgar poll is, and I said this a couple weeks ago, surprisingly, a lot of the rural voters that are the Trump base and supposedly the Perdue base, they don't realize that Perdue is endorsed by the president. You're going to see some Trump rallies, I think sooner rather than later. And I think that basically, and we're going to get into this later on Buckhead cityhood, the former president is interested in the Buckhead cityhood movement.
All right, we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But Theron, are you surprised that the governor is polling this far out in front? I mean, he clearly has the momentum, at least right now, on the Republican side.
Well, it's very early, and so I think that while I'm not surprised in the numbers because Governor Kemp is the governor, and he's been governing at a time where Senator Perdue has not been governing because he lost his race to be reelected to the U.S. Senate. But Lori, I think this race is going to come down to two things. It's going to come down to Trump, and it's going to come down to temperament. Let's start with Trump. This is really a true test of, is the Trump endorsement worth what everyone said it is, right? Can he pull up David Perdue at a time where he's behind in the polls? I know he's going to be doing a fundraiser in Georgia for him very soon. But at a time where Brian Kemp has done a lot to appeal to his conservative base, I think that's the reason why you see the numbers the way they are. And then lastly, temperament. We haven't seen these two gentlemen debate yet. And so I'm waiting to see which one is going to actually kind of get madder or get the most upset at the other one. And will they be able to have the temperament and when they're debating each other? Because all it takes is one mistake, one gaffe for this race to change.
That's must-see TV for us political junkies. Brian, I want to ask you, Phil had mentioned this, the polling has shown that perhaps people don't know the former president has endorsed David Perdue. Do you get that feeling as well? And will the former president be able to help Perdue as much as first thought?
Well, Phil also hit on the money issue. You know, Donald Trump has a lot at stake here. If David Perdue doesn't win, that's going to really put a chink in his armor as the guy who can pick whoever he wants, and that person automatically wins. So do they come out of Mar-a-Lago and open up the purse strings and pour money into Georgia? Right now, Brian Kemp has a significant fundraising advantage, $13 million on hand, whereas former Senator Perdue has less than $1 million on hand. So outside money could play a significant difference, particularly when the Republican Governors Association is going against its tradition by weighing in during a primary, putting up ads that are positive about Brian Kemp. One thing that goes in Brian Kemp's favor on that not many people know about Trump endorsing Perdue is that of those who do know, only 57% are with Perdue. So that shows that people finding out doesn't mean their vote changes.
Interesting. Melita, no matter who wins the Republican primary, they're going to have to raise a lot of money to keep pace with Stacey Abrams.
Absolutely, and you have to remember that this poll is only 1,000 likely Republican voters. This poll skewed old, it skewed white, and the state does not have the same amount of old people and whites as the 90% reflected in this poll. So Stacey Abrams will have the money to appeal to the entire state and not just the 1,000 people Trafalgar polled.
Well, Phil, I'd like to switch gears to something our viewers heard first here on the Georgia Gang, thanks to your sources. Former Governor Sonny Perdue, cousin to David Perdue, was named as the sole finalist for Chancellor of the University System. Now, the American Association of University Professors said the search process was secretive and political. Do they have a point?
Well, you remember last year that the governor who appoints the regents didn't have enough votes to have Sonny Perdue as the chancellor of the university system. And so thanks to some recent reshuffling by the governor and some new appointees on the regents, they had an interview process. And of course, presto, Sonny Perdue is the sole finalist, and he'll be named chancellor soon. But going back to last year's process, they did have various interviews with different people. I think now, though, that you're going to see the coronation of Sonny Perdue, and I think that politically speaking, it could probably help Brian Kemp. I guess that Sonny Perdue is going to have to remain neutral in the GOP gubernatorial primary that we were just talking about.
Melita, you were tough on Sonny Perdue last week, but it appears he'll get the job.
He will, and Phil just hit the nail on the head. This neutralizes Sonny Perdue in the governor's race. Sonny Perdue always was the controlling factor for the Perdue machine, which helped propel him into the governor's race and helped his cousin become the United States Senator. So apparently being chancellor is thicker than even being a cousin. The other thing is that this reminds me of those King Roy ads from the 2002 gubernatorial campaign, when Sonny Perdue himself criticized Roy Barnes for being too authoritarian. And Kemp is showing some of those same tendencies across a wide variety of issues we're discussing today. Buckhead City is one, but primarily the new plant in Middle Georgia. There are a lot of people very upset with how that's been shoved down their throats. People in the university system are upset about how the chancellor vote has been shoved down their throats, even by reshuffling the Board of Regents and appointing political appointees. So it'll be interesting to see how all of this plays out in the governor's race.
We'll get to some of those other issues later on in the show. Brian, weigh in here.
Well, I think when you see Sonny Perdue's argument for why he should be chancellor, he has run a cabinet office in Washington, the Department of Agriculture, which has a massive budget and covers a lot of things, including a lot of social spending. He's been governor of the state. And by the way, the chancellor and the university system falls under the governor of the state. So he's already run it to some degree, and he knows the budget. I remember when Governor Deal got elected, and I was in those budget meetings with then Governor Perdue on his way out. He knew every line of the state budget. This is a guy who knows how to run a large organization. And that is what is going to really matter here. Is he going to get pushback from academia? Sure. That probably helps Governor Kemp in this primary to some degree, to see academia come out and attack his pick for chancellor.
All right, we'll leave it there, folks. Got to wrap it. Coming up, efforts to create a new city of Buckhead appear dead for the session. We'll discuss after the break.
Have a question or comment for the Georgia Gang? Email them at georgiagang@foxtv.com.
Supporters of a new city of Buckhead were dealt a major blow after House Speaker David Ralston agreed with Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan to put a pause on the issue this legislative session. Theron, these Republican leaders really want to give Mayor Andre Dickens time to get a handle on crime in the area?
Well, I want to first start off by thanking Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan and also thanking my friend Speaker Ralston for doing the right thing. But also, before we start thanking those Republican leaders, we got to really give a big shout out to the Democrats that represent that Buckhead area, particularly all of those in the Fulton County delegation. These were the senators and the state representatives who spoke out aggressively very early on, which I believe, Lori, was a very divisive piece of legislation. And I think even the supporters of Buckhead City knew that this was a very slippery slope, because you could set a precedent that would not only be bad for the city of Atlanta, but it was going to be bad for cities all across the state. And so I think that what you saw is that when the leader of this movement became more and more divisive, some of the comments that he was making on social media, to me, I've said this many times before, I think he did more to hurt the citizens in Buckhead who did have concerns about crime and resources and other things that were all important. But I do believe that this bill is dead, but I also believe, Lori, that nothing is dead until Sonny died on the very last day. But definitely think that this is the right thing to do, and definitely want to give Mayor Andre Dickens the opportunity to display his leadership, not only in Buckhead, but throughout the city of Atlanta.
Well, Phil, let's talk about the leader of the group, Bill White, who Theron mentioned. He did not appear to help the cause. As the face of the fight, he was controversial with several of his tweets. You're also hearing some other things about this movement, though. Give us some scoop.
Well, I think that you're going to see a new voice and face for the Buckhead cityhood movement, and that is former State Representative Beth Beskin, who is a Buckhead person. And I think that I agree with Theron. Nothing is ever dead. We've all seen this. I think the panelists would agree over the years that nothing's dead until it's adjournment time on the 40th day of the General Assembly. And anyone can attach an amendment to a germane piece of legislation, and some of the other city bills are going right through. I think what is important to know is that Lieutenant Governor Duncan is no longer going to be Lieutenant Governor next year, and I think that he was the true villain when he came out and said, no, I'm not going to be for this cityhood thing. I'm not going to be for having people having the right to vote as to whether they want a city. That obviously crippled everything, and it all, you know, this high and mighty sanctimonious Lieutenant Governor, he's having a feud with Brandon Beach, the senator who introduced the Buckhead cityhood bill. And so he was determined to try to seek revenge and get even. That's not good government. But finally, with regard to new Mayor Dickens, he's taking steps, he says, to reform things and to curb crime. And I think Speaker David Ralston of the House of Representatives said it best. He said, let's wait to see what happens until next January. And my view is, unfortunately, I don't see the murders and violent crime going down. I hope we can get a new police chief, et cetera, but that's a topic for another day.
Y'all are going long because you're not in the studio with me, so I can't give you time cues. Brian, this issue had a lot of momentum when we were hearing so much about crime, but we never could get a clear answer on what would happen to schools within Buckhead, and I think that gave some parents a cause for concern.
Yeah, absolutely. That had to be part of the deal made with Buckhead voters, with Atlanta voters. What's going to happen to this system and what's going to happen to the tax base for the schools in Buckhead. And that's something that needs to be determined on the front end. We don't need to go in blind and decide that on the back end. As Nancy Pelosi says, read the bill later after we pass it and you'll find out what's in it. You need to know on the front end what's going to be in that bill. It is paused, as you said, not dead. And I talked to someone highly placed at the state capitol this week, and he said it's just going to take one terrible violent crime in Buckhead to revive it. So we're still in this period where we are on eggshells waiting to see what happens, because anything can happen until the last 40th day of the session.
And we've all seen anything could happen. Melita, I want to stay on the cityhood movement, but let's switch it over to Cobb County, where we could see 4 new cities, and county leaders say there that the county government could lose $46 million in annual revenue.
Well, I remember when Sandy...
Melita.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and I think that what's happening is you have Matt Dollar in particular on the city of East Cobb trying to grease the skids so that vote takes place in May, even before the comprehensive economic development studies let the voters really know what they're buying, because he wants to be mayor of this new city. So I think you're rushing the process by trying to have these votes in May. And yes, there will be dramatic impacts on the Cobb County budget. And what we see with all of these cityhood movements, including the Buckhead cityhood movement, is the groups who make money off the formation of a new city, putting a lot of money to stir people up and persuade them to vote for the new city.
All right, a surprise announcement this week from the Chief Justice of Georgia's Supreme Court, David Namias. He announced his retirement, and very quickly, Governor Kemp announced 35-year-old Andrew Pinson would be appointed to replace Namias. Phil, I want you to weigh in here. What happened, and why did this happen so quickly?
Well, I think that the governor wanted to move this quickly and to score points in the judicial community. I will say this, though, Andrew Pinson is a known anti-Trumper. And so the governor is poking the bear in Mar-a-Lago by appointing Pinson.
Theron?
Well, I don't think that that should disqualify this young man for being in this new position. But I would definitely say that, you know, Justice Namias, definitely want to give him a shout out. I know he watches the show, and he's retiring, I think, at a very young age, but want to thank him for his service. But I think, you know, this is just the power of the governor, Laura. I mean, if you just look at what Governor Kemp has been doing, he's been putting political allies in key positions as he gear up to go into a very tough re-election. And so I think that, you know, listen, the guy was clearly vetted, and we'll just have to wait and see how he turns out.
Brian, final word on this, about 30 seconds.
It happened really fast. There was no Judicial Nominating Commission process that went through, and it's because Kemp knew who he wanted. This guy used to work as Solicitor General for Attorney General Carr, who speaks very highly of him. He's got conservative bona fides as a former clerk for Justice Thomas, who's beloved here in Georgia. So I think this is something that'll go over well with Republican voters in that primary.
All right, thanks everybody. Coming up, opponents of the proposed Rivian plant are joining forces to try and stop construction on the $5 billion project.
Join the discussion on the Georgia Gang Facebook page and watch past episodes on the Georgia Gang YouTube channel.
Grassroots efforts are underway to try and stop or at least limit the $5 billion Rivian plant that is expected to be built about 45 miles east of Atlanta. Brian, you know, this was announced by Governor Kemp and others with a lot of fanfare, but some are calling this just a disastrous deal, including some Republican candidates in the 10th Congressional District.
It certainly is one of those issues in a very Republican vote-rich area of the state that Governor Kemp's going to have to pay some attention to, and he's going to have to address it with those voters, because you do see congressional candidates over there coming out against it. What that tells me is that they have data showing that opposing it is good for their campaigns. This, on Kemp's side, if you look at it in a statewide messaging, he's going to say this is the biggest economic development deal in the history of the state, and it's going to bring wealth and great jobs to East Georgia. So there's a strong message on both sides, but I can tell you, as somebody who has been in that governor's office, the vocal minority can often make the wheel squeak more than a silent majority.
True. Melita, do these opponents have a point?
They do. Because the 2017 Comprehensive Land Use Plan for Morgan County called for a lot of green space and gradual growth. And if you're talking about bringing 7,500 new employees into a county which only numbers 20,000 on any given day, on a daily basis for a new plant, that's not gradual growth. So you have retirees who went there because it was a bucolic, country neighborhood kind of place, and now they're worried about pollution, they're worried about traffic, they're worried about the water supply. So these people have some very valid points. And by contrast, the normal environmental protection groups are in a bind here. The old line groups are all greatly in favor of electric vehicles. So these people are organizing on their own, hiring a lawyer, and raising hell.
Interesting. We'll be following this debate in the months to come. Secretary of State Brad Rafensberger says he wants more security at Georgia's polling places and is asking state leaders to allow members of the Georgia State Patrol to assist local law enforcement. Theron, with races expected to be so close, is this a good idea?
Yeah, I don't think this is the best use of taxpayers' money, Lori. I mean, let's just walk through this sort of, narrative that has been created by a lot of Republicans, not all, in the state of Georgia, that are just quite frankly mad that Trump Loeffler and Perdue lost. We've seen audit after audit that clearly showed that there was no voter fraud. We've seen even a recent study just came out where Secretary Rafensberger said that it was all this double voting that happened. I think he even said it was 1,000 double votes, and we saw that it was roughly less than 100 or so that happened. And so I think that this is not the best use of taxpayers' money. I do think we need to make sure that our elections are secure and that they're safe and that they're easy for people to actually get in and vote. But more importantly, I think that this is just another move to the right by Secretary Rafensberger to waste taxpayers' money at a time where I think we already have enough security at these polling places.
Phil, is this a good use of taxpayer money?
Well, no, I think that it's a reasonable request, and I have to laugh at Theron's tired talking points. Fulton County alone, you've had 25 plus years of fraud and mismanagement, and I talked to a Fulton deputy back in 2020 who was supposed to be guarding a drop box, and there was a storm, the camera went out, he got a call, and nobody was watching it. So, and it's very controversial, divisive election this year, so I think it makes sense to have added security.
All right, well, moving on, local maps are causing a lot of controversy under the Gold Dome. This week, State Representative David Wilkerson let his emotions fly on the House floor. Melita, Democrats are upset over the process.
And they have a really good right to be, because for decades, local legislation such as county commission district lines have been handled by the local legislative delegation. But in Cobb, in Gwinnett, in Augusta, those places where Democrats have regained local control, the Republican majority in the full House and Senate have been overriding the local requested maps and putting in a Republican drawn map by the minority of the delegation. So this is one of those things where it may come back to haunt Republicans in the future, particularly when they lose power.
Brian, does Melita have a point? Don't the elected officials in the county usually have more say over their local maps? I mean, what's different this year, and is it right?
Well, as Speaker David Ralston said on this, elections have consequences, and Republicans still control the General Assembly. And people don't know this, but cities and counties are subdivisions of the state. They are subject to state authority. And so all of those maps are drawn and approved by the General Assembly. This is the system. And look, are Republicans taking advantage of their partisan majority? Yeah. Just like the Democrats in Illinois and the Democrats in Maryland and New York are doing in their congressional maps. This is how the process works. This is not controversial. This is not unusual. Georgia is not a standalone example. This is how the process works everywhere.
Theron, I've got 20 seconds if you want to weigh in.
No, I just absolutely agree with what Melita said, but also I know we're running short on time. Just want to congratulate Mayor Bottoms on recently being named as a contributor on CNN, so I wish her the best.
Could you just wait till winners and losers?
Hey, I didn't know. We're not in the studio. I'm just rolling with the flow, Lord.
All right, we'll be back. Winners and losers, everyone. Stay tuned.
Time now for the week's winners and losers.
All right, Theron, back to you, since you already named one of your winners this week.
Well, I thought we were going to get it in on the segment, but thank you, Lori. My first winner is definitely going to be the city of Atlanta. With the Buckhead bill, I think many would say it's dead. I think it's actually almost dead. I definitely want to make sure that we make the city of Atlanta winner. And also ran into Sergeant Gilbert Bush Sr. This week at the Sarvin Building in Buckhead. He's a big fan of the show, so definitely want to give him a big shout out. And then lastly, history was made in Bishop, Georgia, right outside Athens, my hometown, where Deborah Lucas became the first African American to the Bishop Town Council. And this is a little city right outside of Athens in Oconee County. And definitely want to make Pastor Lucas, who's my mother's pastor, a winner this week.
All right, Phil, over to you.
Well, speaking of Athens, Clark County, I'm going to make the loser the District Attorney, Deborah Gonzalez. She actually said on the record that she doesn't believe there's a criminal gang crisis and that she's not going to prosecute people who are charged under the tough gang laws. It's incredible. And again, another soft on crime Democrat. And speaking of another loser, Representative David Wilkerson, who was active in the Cobb County debate over remapping, always playing the race card, calling his opponents racists. And that's, you know, we were talking about civility a few weeks ago. Certainly he should be condemned for these name-calling tactics.
All right, Melita, I got about a minute and a half.
Well, I'll make my winner the members of the House Health and Human Services Committee who sat for 3 hours this week on Wednesday afternoon while Republican Todd Jones and Democrat Mary Margaret Oliver presented the Comprehensive Mental Health Parity Act with 25 supporting witnesses. And this is just a bipartisan effort, and it shows us what government could and should be, and it's an important issue, and I wish we saw more of that under the Gold Dome. My loser of the week is anybody who pays a Georgia Power bill, because Plant Vogtle is now, instead of costing $14 billion, the new estimate is up to $30 billion, and the ratepayers are going to take the hit on this, and it's out of control at Georgia Power.
Brian, over to you.
Georgia Power also said that they were going to absorb, and Southern Company said they would absorb some of those costs. It's something to keep in mind. This is the biggest green energy project happening in the Western Hemisphere. My winner is Andrew Pinson and Sonny Perdue, who we mentioned earlier, and then State House Appropriations Committee Chairman Terry England, a dear friend of mine. He's been at the helm of the state budget for 12 years during all of the Deal administration, all of the Kemp first term. This guy is a dedicated public servant. He is a major loss to the state. He is exactly why I'm against term limits, because we need smart, dedicated people like him to stay.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that. I did want to pay homage to him and all of his service to the state, especially anybody who can handle the budget deserves a shout out on the Georgia Gang. So thank you, everybody, and thank you all for joining us. Hopefully we'll be back here at this table all together again next week. Make it a good one.
The opinions expressed in this broadcast are those of the panelists appearing in this program.